So we're approaching the month of Sivan, and the highlight of the upcoming month, of course, is the holiday of Shavuot, Zman Matan Toratenu, the holiday where we celebrate the receiving of the Torah. And each year, if you want to think about it this way, we receive the Torah all over again with new excitement, with fresh eyes. Um, and one of the most incredible things about um, about the Torah in general is that you can keep coming back to it over and over and see things fresh each time, right? The Torah never ceases to surprise us. And in fact, the Torah quite often, you might say, defies our expectations. And that's always been the case. So here's one way to get that intuition. Just think about the first question in the first Rashi in the whole Torah, right? On the first pasuk in Breshit. So the famous question of Rabbi Yitzchak, who asks, why does the Torah start with all these stories about creation and much more? Tachlis, shouldn't the Torah have started with the first mitzvah? Asks Rabbi Yitzchak, with HaChodesh Hazelachem. Basically, what he's saying is, if the Torah is primarily or fundamentally a book of law, of halacha, a book of mitzvot, and that is Rabbi Yitzchak's assumption, then you might wonder, why does the Torah have all this other stuff in there? Stories, and it goes on, poetry, lots of other stuff. It seems that Rabbi Yitzchak opened up the Torah and was surprised by what he saw there. And so the first Rashi begins by effectively saying, this book may not be what you expect. So let's figure it out together. That's one interpretation of what that first Rashi is saying. So tonight, or at least the question. So tonight, the plan is we're going to learn two sources together that share, you might say, in the same sense of surprise about what the Torah is and how it works. One, and they're going to be two different time frames. One comes from the period of the Rishonim, from the 14th century. The other is modern, written in the 21st century, in the last 25 years. But both are attempts to answer a similar kind of question as Rabbi Yitzchak's from that first Rashi. Namely, if the Torah is fundamentally a book that teaches us laws and mitzvot that we're meant to follow, then why do certain things about the Torah just not seem to fit that mold? Okay, that's going to be the question of the night. And before we get to those sources in particular, let's start with a little background. Let's start by noticing a few things. Actually, let's start with Rabbi Yitzchak's assumption that the Torah is primarily a book of law, of halacha. If that's true, then the first section of the Torah that you'd want to jump to, of course, he says HaChodesh Hazelachem, technically the first mitzvah Bnei Israel receive as they're getting ready to leave Egypt. But if you really wanted to dig into law, then the first place that you would turn to is Parashat Mishpatim. That's really the first collection of laws in the book of Shemot. Mishpatim comes right after the Aseret HaDibrot, right after the Ten Commandments given at Har Sinai. And just after that, the Torah presents us with this major collection of laws that begin, Ve'ele HaMishpatim Asher Tasim Lifnehem. These are the laws that you should put before them. Okay, so basically the story of Sefer Shemot, because so far it's been story and story and story, it stops in its tracks and we get this collection of laws. And think about what the context is within the story that got us there. We just received the Torah at Har Sinai, as I mentioned. We're ready to start keeping mitzvot. So let's go. Na'aseh v'nishma. Let's see what the Torah wants us to do. And the first mitzvah of Parashat Mishpatim is Ki tikneh eved ivri, when you acquire a Jewish slave or servant. Okay, that's a bit surprising. Not the most inspiring of laws. I certainly would not have expected that to be the first law on the list of the first collection of laws in the whole Torah. But okay, let's keep going. Okay, more laws in Parshat Mishpatim. What to do in cases of assault and battery, in the case of theft, when my ox damages you. What to do when you see your enemy's ox suffering under a burden. So the Torah already assumes that you have enemies whose oxes might be suffering under a burden. What's going on here? We just got the Torah. We're excited to start doing mitzvot, to elevate ourselves. So it is kind of surprising that this is what we start with. Instead of with, you might say, a more inspiring collection of laws, we get something much more gritty, something grounded in an imperfect world as it is. Yes, Mishpatim also includes some more positive stuff too. Keep the holidays, keep Shabbat, keep the laws of Shemitah, but overwhelmingly, Parashat Mishpatim is chock full of laws that deal with bad situations that we hope to encounter as little as possible. If we came looking for mitzvot to do, what we find mostly are laws that we hope not to put into practice. Again, slavery, damages, assault. You might say that what the bulk of these laws do is regulating the darker aspects of society. That's actually where the laws of the Torah start, at least the first collection of laws. And the more you think about it, you actually start to realize that this is less unusual than you might think. In fact, the Torah is full of laws that we hope not to practice. Not all of them, of course, but it has way more of these types of laws than you might at first realize. And let's just give some examples just to remind ourselves of a few. So, for example, Eshet Yafat Toar, the law of the beautiful foreign woman that you capture during wartime and bring home with you. The Gemara in Kiddushin says that this is a concession to your Yetzer Hara, to your evil inclination. This is not a mitzvah that you are meant to ever practice, at least not ideally. Okay, less exotic. The laws of divorce, also not something you hope to ever need in practice. Or the laws of Sota, the woman whose husband suspects her of being an adulteress. Again, not a mitzvah you ever hope to perform. You do not hope to perform 613 mitzvot. In fact, the first daf of Masechet Sota says, gives an opinion that it is asur lechatchila. It is actually not even allowed ideally for a man to accuse his wife in this way, which would mean that that's an entire Masechet of Gemara that you hope never to put into practice. And the same thing, amazingly, for Masechet Nedarim, the tractate that deals with the laws of vows. Right? The Torah tells us about that there are vows, what to do, that you're supposed to keep them, actually, what to do if you don't keep them. And there's a whole Masechet, a whole tractate about the laws of vows. And in Masechet Nedarim, the Gemara quotes the view of Rabbi Natan, who says, "Hanoder keilu bana bama." One who makes a vow, it's as if he built an illegal personal altar. And someone who fulfills his vow, ki'ilu makriv alav korban. It's as if he has offered a sacrifice on this illegal altar. Basically, what Rabbi Natan is warning us is don't make vows in the first place. If you do, here are the laws that govern it. But it would be best if you would avoid this whole situation in the first place. So again, we have another Masechet, an entire Masechet of laws that we hope never to put into practice. And of course, the most famous classic Gemara on this topic of laws meant not to be put into practice is the Gemara in Sanhedrin that lists 3 mitzvot that the Gemara at least questions whether they were ever meant to be applied, ever in the past and ever in the future. And those, just to remind ourselves, Ben Sorer Moreh, the rebellious son, a kid so bad that his parents take him to the court where he is sentenced to death. Second, Ir Hanidachat, a condemned idolatrous city that is utterly destroyed. And third, a house smitten with Sarat. Okay, in each case, the Gemara asks the same exact question. If this law was never meant to be put into practice, it was never meant to be applied, then why was the law given in the Torah in the first place? And in each case, the Gemara gives the same answer, which is Drosh v'kabel schar, so that you may learn it and get reward for that learning. Meaning, I guess, the law has value as theoretical law, even if it doesn't have value as practical law. And of course, we should mention, often less quoted, is the fact that in each case, an alternative opinion is quoted as saying that these laws are practical, that in each case, someone actually saw that the law had been implemented in the real world. For example, about the Ben Sorer Moreh, about the rebellious son, Rabbi Yonatan, his opinion is brought, he says, his reaction is brought, I guess you could say. He says, what do you mean this never happened? I saw a case of this where the halacha was applied of Ben Sorer Moreh, and I even sat on his grave. Anyways, that remains a dispute. But the bottom line is, are these laws meant to be practical or not? The Gemara doesn't take a final position. It certainly open to the idea that some of the laws of the Torah are not meant to be put into practice. Still, they have value for us. And so the more you think about it, again, you start to realize, you start to see more often than you would think that there are a lot of mitzvot in the Torah that the Torah itself doesn't really want you to ever do. And others where it's just not super clear whether the Torah wants you to do them or not. And I should be, clear about this. All of this is separate from the fact that the Torah includes negative commandments, right? All the thou shalt nots. So, kind of big picture, we count 248 mitzvot aseh in the Torah, the positive commandments, and 365 lo ta'asehs, negative commandments. Of course, you're not supposed to do the lo ta'asehs. That's a given. But as we've seen, even among the positive commandments, it seems that some of them are not really intended for you, ideally at least, to put them into practice either. So that's, let's say, the first big surprise to keep in mind as background before we get to the sources that we're going to learn together tonight. Just to restate the point, if it's not clear. Surprise number one of the night is you might have thought that the Torah is this guidebook for living an ideal life or a guidebook for building an ideal society under an ideal set of laws to live by. That the goal is to keep all of the 613 mitzvot, or at least as many as possible, as often as possible. But that can't exactly be it. Because as we've seen, there's so many laws in the Torah that we're ideally meant never to do, or to do as little as possible. There has to be something going on here. Okay? Okay. That was kind of surprise number one. Okay, surprise number two. Especially when we think about how the halachot are applied through the lens of the Torah Shebaal Peh. In many cases, the letter of the law is extremely impractical to apply in the real world. So for example, and this is talking about the laws that you were meant to apply, it seems. But even in those cases, it seems that often it's very hard to actually apply the Torah's laws. So for example, to convict someone according to halacha, the law requires that not only are there witnesses to the crime, but something further. The witnesses must first admonish the potential criminal that the thing that he's about to do is a crime. The witnesses are supposed to do this. So the witnesses are supposed to tell this potential criminal that if he proceeds, he will be punished. And then the lawbreaker would be proceeding in full knowledge that what he's about to do, he's about to get busted and he will be punished. And this process of it kind of admonishing the potential lawbreaker, technically the term for that is hatra'ah, okay? Halachic warning. Without this legal formality, you cannot punish the criminal. Now, let's be honest. It's almost impossible to imagine a case in practice where this would ever happen, right? This element of halacha is extremely impractical. Imagine that someone's about to commit murder, okay? In the extreme case, someone's about to commit murder. And so we need two witnesses there on the scene to convict. And they have to be kosher witnesses. And before the deed is done, they have to warn the assailant, is that the right word? They have to warn the guy who's about to commit the murder, okay? What you're doing is asur. What you're doing is against the law. Halt, or you will be punished. And he has to reply, yes, I know that, nevertheless, and then go ahead and commit the murder. Okay, this is quite a scene. Honestly, it's kind of hard to picture this in real life. Not to mention the fact that the halachic laws of evidence are complex. Basically, if you follow the letter of the law to a T, it will almost be impossible to ever convict anyone. And along these lines, the Mishnah in Makot, in the first parak of Makot, says, Sanhedrin hahoreget echad b'shavua nikret chavlanit. Basically, a Sanhedrin that puts someone to death once every 7 years is considered a destructive court. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah omer echad l'shiv'im shana. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says even if they put someone to death one in 70 years, that would be too much. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva omrim, ilu hayinu besanhedrin lo nherag adam me'olam. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, living after there was no Sanhedrin instituting capital punishment in their day, but they say, had we been part of a Sanhedrin that had the power to implement capital punishment, we would have never applied it. To which Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel responds, Afhen merabim shofchei damim beYisrael. By having this attitude, he would say, you're actually increasing the number of murderers within the Jewish people, basically because there is no consequence. Okay, basically. So this is a very interesting mission. Basically, the Torah is full of laws, but everyone seems to acknowledge that the enforcement of those laws based on the system as it stands on the books, as the law exists in books, is very hard to implement. And so the rabbis debated whether the impracticality of applying, let's say, as we saw, the death penalty, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And they debated that. But notice that all this is regardless of the fact that the death penalty is on the books for certain crimes. Nevertheless, the fact that it's the law in the books does not necessarily imply for the rabbis that it should often or maybe even ever be applied. According to Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, they would have been happy, it seems, if it was never applied. Okay, another Gemara takes this line even further. We're told in a Gemara in Avodah Zarah, it also shows up in Sanhedrin, okay, that 40 years before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, 40 years before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the Sanhedrin exiled itself from its kind of place in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Lishkat HaGazit, kind of its home base. And it says, we're told that the Sanhedrin voluntarily stopped implementing capital punishment. Whatever the law might say on the books, the Sanhedrin apparently gave up its ability to apply the law as written. So the Gemara asks, "My taima, why did they do that? Kevan dechazu denefishe lehu rotzchim velo yachile lemidan." Okay, why did they do this? Because they saw that there were so many murderers that they couldn't put them all to death. Again, whatever the letter of the law said, the Sanhedrin realized that in practice they were not going to be able to enforce it, at least not at that moment in time. Okay, so we saw punishments under the Torah, very difficult to enforce. And we saw that at times the court itself might decide not to enforce the letter of the law. The extreme version of this is the statement of Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, who, for example, said that if it was up to them, capital punishment would never have been applied. At some point in history, the Sanhedrin actually took up that position and stopped applying it themselves, for whatever set of historical reasons that they were living through. Okay, so given all this, how are we supposed, kind of the next question this all leads to is, how are we supposed to manage a society if halacha gives us many laws, but few ways of practically enforcing them? How is that supposed to work in practice? Many laws, but few ways of practically enforcing them. So that, of course, Chazal kind of dealt with this as well. There's a Mishnah Sanhedrin that tells us, Hahoreg nefesh shelo be'edim. Let's say someone commits murder, but there are no witnesses. Machnisin oto lakipa, uma'achilin oto lechem tsar umayim lachatz. If someone murders but there are no witnesses, we put him in a certain vaulted chamber and we feed him minimal food and water. And the Gemara then, following up on this Mishnah, quotes the view of Shmuel, who says that we do this in a case where there were witnesses, that when the Mishnah said there are no witnesses, actually what it meant was that there were witnesses, but there was no hatra'ah, there was no admonishment. So this is a case where we kind of know what justice demands, but because of this impractical, formal, legal technicality, the murderer would always get off scot-free. So if the letter of the law doesn't work, we have an alternative solution to keep the peace. We take this person who we kind of know did it, even though technically we are not able to convict under the actual law, and we deal with him. Okay, we put him and we kind of starve him or fill him up with food that will actually make him sick. Anyways, different versions of what exactly that means, but anyways, we deal with it, let's just say. And similarly, there's a Gemara in Sanhedrin that says, Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Shamati shebeitin makin ve'onshin shalom min Torah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says, I heard that a court may administer lashes and capital punishment even when not required by the Torah. V'lo la'avor al divrei Torah, and not in order to violate the Torah. They're not following the Torah. They're implementing these punishments, which the Torah does not really allow them or ask them to do. Okay, but he says that they're not doing it in order to be violative of the Torah. Ella kedei lasot siag l'Torah. Rather, they are doing this as a siag, as a kind of additional protective layer, let's say, of law around the Torah. But in any case, they are applying not just not just kind of not just the types of punishments that would be d'Rabbanan, but they're actually applying even as far as capital punishment, let's say. Okay, anyways, point is, sometimes the rabbis may add punishments not dictated by the Torah. They may go farther than the Torah would have allowed for the sake of the Torah. And here's how the Rashba, okay, the Rashba, is kind of great Spanish 13th century sage, right? So he says, this is how he puts it. He says, and I'm just going to read through this in English. He says, for if you allow all to depend on the laws specified, if you allow all to depend on the laws specified in the Torah, doing nothing but what the Torah provides with respect to the infliction of punishments and so forth. And this is a quote from him. He says, the world would be destroyed, for everything would require witnesses, edim, and admonition, hatra. As the sages of blessed memory said, Jerusalem was destroyed only because they based all their judgments solely on the specifications of Torah law. And how much more is that the case outside of the land of Israel, where our courts do not impose fines either, and irresponsible people burst all the bounds of conduct, and the world could be made desolate. Okay, so he's basically saying that if you just followed the law as it is in books, again, the world would be destroyed. The world would be made desolate. Still, in each and every, now kind of going back to quoting him, still in each and every place, courts do sometimes render judgments so as to restrain the contemporary populace. And so they do in every generation, in every place, as the circumstances demand. Okay, let's pause. Let's try to sum up a little bit what we've seen. If you were expecting Torah law, okay, the Torah law, to be a perfect system of laws that tells us how to live an ideal life, and to create a perfect set of laws for ordering an ideal society, you quickly run into at least these two surprises that we've seen so far tonight. One, the Torah, as perfect as it is, includes many laws that even on its own terms seem to be non-ideal, laws that we hope you will never put into practice. And we discussed many of those above, so I won't repeat them. But if you need one or two as a placeholder, think of the first law of Mishpatim, Jewish slavery, not ideal. Or think about the law of how you can take a beautiful woman home with you from war, not ideal. Okay, these are laws on the books, but we saw that even big chunks of Shas, of the Gemara, entire Masechtas, involve laws that we hope you will never use, or use as sparingly as possible. So if the Torah's laws as they are ideal and perfect, let's say, then what are all these about? That's kind of one. Second, the legal system of the Torah is extremely impractical. So impractical that the Mishnah already talks about alternative mechanisms by which we actually regulate society, because the letter of the law doesn't always work. Okay, so how do we make sense of a Torah that is eternal in its vision, but also seems to include some aspects that feel like they just don't totally work, or maybe they're a work in progress, or they're impractical, that we need workarounds for. Anyways, thinkers over the centuries have attempted to try to think through this exact question. So we're going to go through two tonight. Okay, that'll be kind of the second half of this year. First is setting up the problem. Second is we're going to go through two attempts to explain how this is actually supposed to work. Okay, the first is from the Ran, Rabbeinu Nisim of Gerona. The Ran also lived in Christian medieval Spain, in the 14th century. And he was part of this school that over the course of a couple hundred years produced a series of giants, the Ramban, the Ritva, the Rashba, and more. And we noted before that it's the Rashba who already focused on this issue, that the letter of the Torah's law cannot be relied upon to regulate society. Okay, so following up on this topic, right? The Rashba lived before the Ran. Okay, following up on the same topic, kind of from the same school, in one of the Drashot Haran, in one of the sermons given by the Ran, this one is on Parshat Shoftim. So this is the line that Shoftim begins with, is Shoftim v'shotrim titen lecha bechol sha'arecha asher Hashem Elokecha noten lecha lishmatecha v'shaftu et ha'am mishpat tzedek. Okay, that's the first line of Mishpatim. You shall appoint magistrates and officials for your tribes in all the settlements that God Hashem is giving you. And they shall govern the people with due justice. Mishpat tzedek. Okay, so this is the Ran back in his day was giving a drasha based on that line. And here's how the drasha went. He says, Aval, be'enai, pshat, hakatuv kachu. He says, in my view, the pshat meaning of the verse is as follows. And he says, it's well known. I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between English and Hebrew in the interest of time. He says, it's well known that humankind requires a judge to adjudicate among its members. For if not, each man would swallow his fellow alive, and the world would become corrupted. Okay, she'im lo ken ish et re'eu chayim belo. We would swallow each other alive. V'chol omer tzricha lazeh yishuv medini. Every nation. Sorry, I misread that. V'chol umma tzricha lazeh yishuv medini. And every nation needs some form of yishuv medini. Let's say civil order. Okay, and then he quotes. He says, even and the chacham, which presumably here means the philosophers, say that even thieves have to agree on some form of fairness between them. It's kind of like we have that saying, there's honor among thieves. This is like there's justice among, or thieves' justice. Okay, everybody needs rules to live by. Let's say, Yisrael tzrichin zeh keyeter ha'omot, and Israel needs these just like all other nations need them. And then he says, and beyond this, Israel needs judges for an additional reason. So beyond what every other people of the world, they need courts and magistrates, etc. Shoftim v'shofrim. They need that because they need to keep order, because that's just the way of the world. But we, Bnei Israel, need it for another reason: to uphold the laws of the Torah and to punish those liable for lashes or capital punishment by the court when they transgress the laws of the Torah, even though such a transgression may entail no loss to civil order at all. Okay, this is interesting. He says, even in a case she'ein be'ota avera have said yishuv medini klal. It says there are tons of laws of the Torah that violating them does not disrupt civil order, right? And yet we need judges for a second reason under Torah law, not just to implement kind of justice and civil order, but also to impose all these other laws of the Torah that actually you don't violate civil order by breaking them, but they're important. And so we need some court system for dealing with that. And he's trying to separate these two as being different enough. Okay, and then he says he kind of goes on and he says that there is no doubt that in each of these domains, which he set up, remember what he's calling, let's say, Torah law and civil order. Okay, says that in each one, two situations may arise. One case will require punishing a person according to true and just law, mishpat amiti, true and just law. Okay, and the other case is where it would not be proper to punish him according to true justice. It's not a problem of tzedek amiti, but rather it would be needed to punish him because you need civil order and for the needs of the moment. Okay, that's starting to come together, that there's kind of these two sides. On the one hand, you need laws and courts because you need civil order. And the other is you need laws and courts because you need to deliver true justice, tzedek amiti, which is somehow different. Okay? And then he says that we have to he says that again, you have mishpat amiti, true justice, mishpat amiti, true justice, and tzorech sha'ah, exigencies of the moment, needs of the moment, what you need to kind of keep order. True justice is the domain, he says, of the Sanhedrin and of the rabbinical courts that fall under them. Okay, these courts apply halacha in its pristine form, practical or impractical, true justice. The Sanhedrin and the rabbinical courts apply the letter of the law in a way that does not bend to tzorech sha'ah, to the lower needs of the moment right? They're kind of more elevated. But the Ran says that if all that we had was the legal system as it is on the books, and all we had was kind of pristine theoretical law, then society could not function. So he says there's a second mechanism off the halachic books, you might say, that we use to govern society in a practical and efficient way. And that is where he says, Umivnei hasidur hamedini, in order to keep civil order, he says that you have, because of that, you have mitzvat hamelech. You have commandment to appoint a king. Okay, interesting. The king is playing this second role that the letter of the law does not get done. Basically, you have this off the books solution, which is that you have the power of the sovereign. Today, you might say the power of the state. Back then, you would have said the power of the king, the power of the sovereign. Basically, according to the Ran, the sovereign enforces a different kind of law than the Torah's law. The sovereign enforces practical law. In any given case, the law of the king might mirror what it says in the written halacha, or it might not. In contrast to the Sanhedrin, that applies the pristine letter of the law, the sovereign takes into account the realities of the day, the exigencies of the moment. The sovereign takes into account sorach sha'ah, the needs of the moment. And the king's laws are not eternal. But in the moment, the law of the sovereign has the last word in practice, because that's what's needed to maintain an ordered society, at least in that sphere. Okay? So anyways, the point that the Ran is making, that there's this difference between the law in books and the law in action, is way ahead of its time. So just to put this in perspective, in American law, much, much later, Roscoe Pound, the dean of Harvard Law School, wrote in a very celebrated paper in 1910, he wrote a paper called The Law in Books and the Law in Action. And that article is considered groundbreaking for its day, and Pound highlighted the disconnect between sometimes the law as it's written, the law in books, and the laws it's actually implemented, the law in action. And this observation resonated with reformers, scholars, especially in the progressive era, who were concerned that the law wasn't always delivering justice in practice, whatever it might say in the books. And so Pound argued that the law needs to be about more than just legal formalism. It had to be judged on whether it meets society's needs. Okay, that's all very exciting stuff in the early 1900s. Our rabbis were grappling with the same set of issues back in the 13th and 14th century. Not that we necessarily solved it in exactly the same way, but kind of our tradition's already dealing with this many, many hundreds of years earlier. Okay, so that was kind of the discussion of the Ran, which was this whole concept again of mishpat amiti, pristine law, versus mishpat hamelech or tzorech sha'ah, kind of practical law. Okay. Now let's move to contemporary times. All these questions that we've been exploring tonight about the surprising nature of halacha, about laws that seem non-ideal or impractical, about the distinction between the law in books and law in action, it's not just academic. We've been talking about it kind of up here, but these debates became much more urgent and real with the founding of the State of Israel. Because for centuries, halacha was largely a communal and personal system. Okay, it governed the rhythms of Jewish life, Shabbat, Kashrut, family law, ritual practice, even monetary disputes within Jewish communities, but never with the full apparatus of a state. Okay, Jews didn't have the power to legislate for society at large or to enforce law with the coercive power of the state. And all that changed in 1948. So for the first time in 2,000 years, the Jewish people had political sovereignty, an army, a police force, a judicial system, a legislature. There were different things that you could point to along the way that have, kind of rhyme with these things, but nothing like an actual state where for the first time in a long time, Jews would have to ask questions like, what role should halacha play in the governance of a modern state? And can halacha offer a comprehensive system of law for running a country? And if halacha is not always practical, as we've seen, then how do we bridge the gap between Torah ideals, which are kind of internal and always lasting, with the needs of today, of actually governing a practical society? And how does all this relate to the functioning of a democratic state, such as the State of Israel? All these questions became much more like more in focus, let's say. So there are many approaches to this, okay? But just like we talked about the Ran is just a very interesting approach from his time. Let's talk about a certain thinker who confronted these issues. We're going to talk a little bit about how he thought about it, and that is Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich. Okay, so he was the former Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Birkat Moshe, which is a Hesder Yeshiva in Ma'ale Adumim. And Rav Rabinovich, super interesting, just an amazing, interesting person. I actually think doesn't get enough airtime in necessarily. But anyways, a very interesting thinker. Canadian-born originally, studied at Ner Yisrael, also studied mathematics at Johns Hopkins. He was the head of Jews College in London before he made Aliyah. And among his most notable students, they include Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who often spoke of Rav Rabinovich as a teacher and mentor. And Rav Rabinovich was deeply committed to building a society guarded by that would be guided by Torah values, but in the real world that includes issues of statecraft and taking responsibility for a country of our own. Okay, he's kind of in the category of rabbis in Israel who really tried to put the pieces together, let's say, of kind of the law and as it stood in books and the law in action in the creation of a state. Okay, now in a short but very interesting essay called The Way of Torah, this is written in the year 2002, Rav Rabinovich confronted many of the issues that we've touched on tonight. And you might say that he picks up where the Ran left off. So in the article, Rav Rabinovich lays out a theory of practical halacha that confronts a lot of these tensions that we've been probing between, on the one hand, the Torah's lofty aspirations, and on the other hand, the need for real-world governance. Okay, the second section of that article is called, this is the title of the second section is The Real and the Ideal. That's the title of the second section. And this, I'm going to read the beginning of that section. Okay, it goes as follows. It says, the system of Torah and commandments is twofold. On the one hand, it conveys concepts, instills eternal values, and directs people to the service of God at the highest levels and to the formation of a society worthy to be the bearer of God's presence. Okay. On the other hand, it encompasses legislation and commands to combat the forces of evil and destruction that erupt within the individual soul and the nation's spirit, and to ensure that the necessary conditions for spiritual development are satisfied to the greatest possible extent, given each generation's situation and the social, economic, and cultural circumstances prevalent at any given time and place. Okay, I know that was a lot, but then basically he's saying that on the one hand, the Torah is giving us laws. This is stuff we've seen. The Torah is giving us laws that are eternal values, all right? Concepts. Some of these are phrased in the words of laws, but at the end of the day, they're really about teaching us concepts and values, whereas other ones are about combating evil forces that have to be kind of dealt with. Okay, so now he continues. For the first objective, the Torah places before us lofty goals that challenge and motivate the generations, for even the noblest of people cannot attain them in full. Says that the laws that we have in the Torah that are about setting our kind of lofty moral goals, those are there to challenge and motivate us, even if we never attain them in full. They're kind of aspirational law, you could say. Okay, and then he says at the same time it establishes for the second objective, that is the objective of kind of ordering society. He says that they have criteria for conduct that people can, as a practical matter, accept minimum standards that must be met to avoid endangering the survival of the individual and the society in which he is placed and giving up all hope of spiritual uplift. Okay, I'm going to try to summarize this because, again, it's a very dense article. But that is to say that the Torah tries to do two things at the same time. It's a document written for all time, and it attempts at the same time to be both idealistic and practical. It attempts to do, according to Rav Rabinovich, two separate things at the same time. One is to set highest possible aspirations, lofty goals. And second, to provide minimum standards minimum standards for how we should act in an imperfect world. At the same time, lofty goals and aspirations, and at the same time, minimum standards of conduct in an imperfect world. Okay, in the first category, the aspirational laws. Some laws are written in legal language, but their real job is to teach us moral lessons, even if never implemented. Their goal is to set a moral trajectory for society. For example, the laws of Yibum, you might say, teach us about the importance of supporting this family going through tragedy, even though we should hopefully never put it into practice. Or the laws of to destroy Amalek, even if there's no Amaleki out there in the world to be dealt with. Even so, the law teaches us kind of deeper lessons that we could take. Even if the law is never put into practice, the moral message that we need to root out evil from the world is operative. For these laws, and for a whole bunch that we saw before, practicality is not the point. They're really like moral lessons phrased in legal language. And maybe that's the meaning of the Gemara's statement about those 3 mitzvot that the Gemara itself considered whether they may or may not be practical. The Gemara says, why were they written? Drosh v'kabel schar. Study them and thereby benefit from that study. Sometimes people think that what that means is study them and kind of get like mitzvah points for having studied these laws, as if like the study itself is is the whole point. But this is a little bit of a different take on that. Drosh v'kabel schar from in this reading would mean that they're there to be learned, and their lessons are valuable, even if never practiced. So it's a little bit of a different take. Okay, that's kind of category 1, aspirational law. Second category, regulatory law. Some laws are meant to order society as it is, unvarnished, as imperfect as it may be. These laws are not aspirational. They're practical, but they're so practical that they set minimum standards that are necessary for social order or social stability. And because they're minimum standards, sometimes we actually hope not to use them, or to use them less and less over time. So for example, some of the laws that we looked at before, there are some of the laws like slavery that are there, let's say, to temper its worst aspects. Over time, thankfully, we've discontinued the practice entirely. But in its day, the laws that constrained slavery were practically important. They were not just aspirational, they were practically important to move the ball forward. Similarly, the Torah, let's say, another example he gives, the Torah allows men to have multiple wives, even if that's not a great idea. Okay, at the time, let's say adultery was the key issue to root out. Polygamy would have to wait. But eventually, we legislated that one away as well. Okay, so as we noted before, it's not always easy to figure out. Once you start thinking about it this way, it's not always easy to figure out which of the laws of the Torah are the ideal ones, the aspirational ones, and which ones are just the theoretical ones, or which ones are just the practical ones for the moment that we're meant somehow to transcend over time. How are we even supposed to determine this? Okay, this is once you kind of make these distinctions, they themselves are kind of hard to implement. To use the language that the Ran used earlier, how are we supposed to determine which laws are mishpat amiti, which are true justice, kind of pristine true justice, and which ones are tzorach sha'ah, which ones are kind of like practical for the moment, but maybe not for practice always over time? In a sense, what Rav Rabinovich is doing, you may start to notice, is that he's basically reviving the Ran's model, and what he proposes is that the Jewish people, through democratic means, are today empowered to play the role that the sovereign, that the king once played. Okay, so I'll say that again, because that's like a huge move of his. He basically says, what he's basically saying is that the Ran made this distinction between kind of like impractical, perfect law and practical law as it's applied by the king, even if it doesn't necessarily follow the letter of the law, but as it needs to be applied in the real world. He's kind of taking that a step forward and basically saying that today there is no king, but the concept of the sovereign still applies. The sovereign is what we, as the Jewish people, determine through democratic means. Okay, so when it comes to the application of laws that order society, the sovereign has the last word. The sovereign's laws are not eternal, they're temporary, they're practical, they reflect the needs of the moment. And so when it comes to ordering society, The sovereign is in charge. It and only it controls the coercive power of the state. And so Rabinovich argues that in Israel today, the Knesset plays that role that the king once did. But Rabinovich is careful to note that this power is limited to making and executing laws that are there to order society. When it comes to all the other stuff in the Torah, ritual law, for example, authority in that sphere is retained by the rabbis, by the Sanhedrin. Okay, when it comes to ritual law, the rabbinic authorities do not yield their power to the state. Now, they don't have the same power to impose punishments. That's the trade-off. If you want to impose the punishments, then that's kind of under the domain of the state. If you want to have the more kind of inspirational, aspirational aspects of law, then at best, the laws by which you're meant to kind of impose them on the population are impractical, right? The rabbinical authorities continue to interpret and apply halachic rules that set our vision, our aspirations, that lay out a moral life, let's say, but they don't have a real enforcement power standing behind them. And you can see what Rabinovich is doing. He's basically explaining the workings of a modern democratic state with a separation of responsibilities between religious and secular spheres in halachic language that goes back to the writings of the Ran and others who've been thinking about these questions for a long time. Okay, so we've been going for a while. We've covered a lot of ground. I'm going to try to wrap it up because we've covered a lot. So let's try to review what we saw tonight. Okay, so we started by saying that every Shavuot, we receive the Torah anew, so to speak. Okay, we celebrate the giving of the Torah, the receiving of the Torah. That gives us a chance to look at it with fresh eyes once again each year. And every time that we look at the Torah, we should be ready for new insights, because as we saw, even in that first Rashi and Breshit, the Torah never ceases to surprise us. Now, often, maybe before we reflect on it, we conceive of the Torah as if it's a rule book. That kind of is Rabbi Yitzchak's question, right? If the Torah is a rule book, why doesn't it just have a bunch of rules? And that sometimes we think of it as primarily a book of law, a book of mitzvot, which tells us if you just did these things, you would live an ideal life or construct an ideal society. But we saw in so many cases that the Torah is much more complex than this. And so we studied two texts that attempted to make sense of how it can be that the Torah is at the same time, one, full of eternal truths that guide us and inspire us, and on the other hand, inclusive of many laws that seem, let's say, b'diavad at best, and in some cases not to be practical at all. So we did these two sources. From the Ran, we saw that the Torah offers us two related but different things. One he calls mishpat amiti, true justice that reflects eternal values. But that also leaves room for something different, which is tzorach sha'ah, the pressing needs of the moment. And we saw how far ahead the Ran was thinking about this distinction between the difference between, you might call it in kind of more modern language, the law in books versus the law of action, the law in action. They are not the same thing. The law in books and the law in action are not necessarily the same thing. And from Rav Rabinovich, we saw that two aspects of the Torah, its visionary aspects and its regulatory aspects. You have to take both of them seriously if the Torah is going to be applied in the modern world. Okay, which is to say that the role of the sovereign today, in this view, in a democratic society, is it's kind of playing the role to some extent of what the king in the Ran system did, right? Rabinovich sees a natural separation of powers in our own halachic system. We look to the sovereign to handle the job of ordering society and to wield the coercive power of the state, and we look to the rabbis, the rabbinic authority, the Sanhedrin, the rabbinical courts for eternal matters, rituals, and values, the things that elevate our spiritual lives. Each one has kind of its own role to play and should not trespass on the other one's domain. That's the takeaway from that very, very interesting article. Anyways, to wrap it up, the goal tonight was not to solve all these complex issues, really more to raise some really interesting things. And more than anything, I hope to give an example of what it means in practice to accept the Torah on Shavuot new each year. because Zman Matan Toratenu means that we receive the Torah every year in our own times, in our own circumstances, in our own day, and questions that once lived only in theory, amazingly, in our times have become real again. Issues of halacha and of governance and of sovereignty, of how moral vision and practical application interact. This is not just like the stuff in books. This is not just the stuff of dreams. They're actually part of our lived experience today. And that is a blessing and a challenge. Okay. But above all, you would say it's a zchut. It's a zchut to be part of a generation that gets to wrestle with these complexities, not just as speculation, but as lived reality. And if you want to say it in kind of a poetic way, a chance to accept the Torah and bring it down, to the mountain, to our own lives, and implement it in this world in a way that we haven't had the chance in many, many years.